So good afternoon, everybody, and or I should say good afternoon, I'm sure, to many of you, but maybe to some of you, good morning or good evening as well. But to all of you, a very warm welcome to this first series, this first seminar, I should say, apologies for that, this first webinar in a series of webinars that we have focusing on some of the key issues ahead of WRC-23. I think we have, at last count, around about 600 people registered to attend this event from all over the world, and we're delighted to have all of you with us. In a second, I'm going to pass over to Mark Colville from Analysys Mason, who's going to be moderating today's webinar. But before I do, there are just a few things that I wanted to very quickly mention. First of all, and very importantly, I wanted to say a big thank you to all of our sponsor and partner organizations who've been associated with this event and with the other events that are taking place as part of this series. So you can see the logos listed on the screen next to me here. So to all of our partners, a really big thank you. And without you, this series would not be possible. So we really do appreciate your support and your involvement. Next, I just wanted to very briefly talk a little bit about the background of this series. So the idea for running the 3 webinars that we are came from a question that we asked as part of the audience poll at all of the Global Spectrum Series conferences that we ran last year, when we asked what people expected to be the most prominent issues at WRC23. And as you will see from the table on the slide here showing the results, there were 3 clear issues that came out as quite comprehensively those that people thought would be the most prominent and the most important ahead of WRC. And those were the UHF, the 3.5, or I should say the 3.3 to 3.8 gigahertz band, and the 6 gigahertz band. So on that basis, we've come up with this series of webinars that's going to be focusing specifically with one of them on each of those key issues. And I think the main difference between maybe these events and some of our regional spectrum conferences is we wanted to take the opportunity to look at these issues from a real global focus, I suppose. So we've got regulators participating at the event, both in the audience and with us as speakers, representing all different regions, and we're delighted to have all of them with us. And of course, our industry speakers will also be looking at things from a global perspective. So we have the focus today on UHF band, and then the 2 following webinars, which we'll be talking a little bit more about maybe at the end of the session today, looking at C band and 6 gigahertz. So please do make sure you're joining us for those as well. But today we're going to be focusing specifically on the 470 to 694 megahertz band, the UHF band, and looking at the future use of that band. As I've mentioned, we have a global lineup of speakers with us today, sorry. And this is the program that we're going to be having, the schedule that we have for the webinar. We're going to be starting very shortly with an introduction from Mark Colville, just to give us an overview of the key issues. We're then going to be hearing a presentation from Nikolai Vasiliev from ITU, who's going to be outlining maybe some of the key positions ahead of WRC from the ITU perspective. Before we move to hear from the different industry positions, so we have 4 industry speakers with us, and then a response from regulators. Again, we have 4 regulators here as well. And then finally, we're going to be looking at having a bit of a discussion amongst the speakers, and also questions from all of you out there. So we're really keen to hear from all of you. Any questions or comments you have, please do post those in the chat, and those we brought across and put to our speakers and participants during the discussion part of the session. So we've got a busy 2 hours ahead of us. So without further ado, I would like to kick things off by passing over now to our moderator for the session, so to Mark Colville from Analysys Mason. So Mark, welcome. Great to have you with us. And I know you're going to be giving us a brief introduction and then introducing our speakers. So without further ado, over to you.
Great. Thank you very much for the introduction, Dan, and great to be here as well. Good day to everybody, wherever you're joining from, and welcome to this Forum Europe webinar on the future of the UHF. Dan, if we could move on to first slide, please, and I'll go through a brief introduction as you've suggested. So next slide, please. I wanted to start in the context of agenda item 1.5 of looking at how the 470 to 960 megahertz frequency range is currently used in region 1. And there are some significant similarities in the historic use of this spectrum across the different parts of Region 1. In particular, the 900 megahertz band is used across the region for mobile services, with the 800 megahertz band largely assigned for the same purpose. And the 700 megahertz band is now in the process of being assigned, with different sub-regions of Region 1 perhaps at different stages of that assignment process. Below 694 megahertz, the spectrum is generally assigned for TV broadcasting, with other uses such as PMSE possible on a geographically interleaved basis. It's the future of this sub 700 megahertz or 470 to 694 megahertz spectrum, though, where there might be some conflicting views within Region 1 on agenda item 1.5 at WRC-23. In Europe, the sub 700 megahertz portion of the UHF is set to remain in use for broadcasting in PMSE until at least 2030, although the question of what happens after 2030, and perhaps in some cases before 2030, is starting to be asked. In Africa, there's also generally support for continued broadcast use of sub 700 megahertz spectrum, including other uses such as TV white space for providing rural broadband solutions. By contrast, in the Middle East, where DTT is less heavily relied upon, there's already a push to start using some of the spectrum for mobile services. And in this context, the 600 megahertz band, or 3GPP band 71, is garnering a lot of interest. So as is shown at the bottom of the slide here, the 600 megahertz band offers 2 times 35 megahertz of paired spectrum, which importantly has a band plan that's compatible with the Region 1 700, 800, and 900 megahertz bands. Next slide, please, Dan. On this next slide, we can see that also importantly, this 600 megahertz band is already in use in North America and US outlying territories, with further interest in the band in other parts of the Americas and Asia, including some planned auctions in the likes of Mexico and Colombia. Saudi Arabia and, one suspects, subsequently other Middle Eastern countries are also starting to look at planning auctions for this spectrum, as I think one of our speakers, Mohammed, will outline shortly. And this potential for alignment with an existing 600 megahertz band plan that's in use across regions could, of course, be of great benefit in terms of equipment and device ecosystems. So the 600 megahertz band definitely has its attractions. However, and if we move to my final slide, please, Dan, given some of the demand and technology trends that we're seeing, there's a question of whether the 600 megahertz is really the right long-term approach, or at least outside of the Middle East. Firstly, I think we'll certainly hear about this from some of our speakers, but there continues to be strong demand for DTT services in many European markets. The loss of 700 megahertz spectrum from broadcasting has already squeezed capacity available to broadcasters, and removing further UHF spectrum could create significant challenges. As you chip away at that broadcast spectrum, it makes DTT progressively less viable in terms of its ability to compete with other modes of delivery like satellite and fiber. And certainty is, of course, important for investors. Secondly, and although developments are very rapid in this area, it's not currently obvious quite how much benefit there might be to the mobile industry from further sub 1 gigahertz spectrum, or at least in a conventional style sub 1 gigahertz band offering paired spectrum with limited bandwidth like the 600 megahertz band. I say that because most of the widely talked about benefits of 5G, at least in an enhanced mobile broadband context, manifest themselves for larger blocks of spectrum and therefore, as things stand, are perhaps most relevant in bands above 2 or 3 gigahertz. Moreover, there are some other sub 1 gigahertz bands that are starting to be considered for use, like the SDL in the center gap of 700 megahertz and even the 1500 megahertz. And technological innovations like DSS are making things easier for mobile operators. What is clear, though, is that with a very large amount of spectrum in higher bandwidths, higher frequencies rather, being made available to mobile services, the proportion of capacity that's coming from sub 1 gigahertz spectrum is shrinking. And that is going to have implications for the consistency of mobile data services across the network. And if we're not careful, potentially there are issues of widening the digital divide here. So what are the alternatives to the 600 megahertz band? Well, continued DTT use across the 470 to 694 megahertz range is certainly one. At the other end of the scale, using the whole of that spectrum for a TDD band plan for mobile services with larger carrier sizes is another option. Or perhaps to try and mitigate some of the age-old problems of different countries being in different positions and cross-border interference preventing neighboring countries from following different approaches, might a hybrid of STL, supplementary downlink for mobile broadband, and 5G broadcast be an option? TDD and SDL solutions certainly don't have today's 600 megahertz ecosystem, but might they be more attractive to mobile service providers in the long run, given the larger bandwidths that they might be able to offer? None of these are particularly easy questions, but I think they're some of the questions that need to be studied in more detail ahead of WRC-23. With that, I'd like to conclude my opening remarks, and I'd like to invite our first speaker to the stage. We're very lucky to have with us today Nikolai Vasilyev, who's Chief of the Terrestrial Services Department at the Radio Communications Bureau of the ITU. Nikolai, thanks for joining us, and over to you for your opening presentation.
Thank you very much, Mark. I work in the Radio Communication Bureau of ITU. We're responsible for organizing World Radio Communication Conference, so my presentation will look at the issue from this angle. Next, please. UHF band is quite bright example of how evolving technologies changes frequency allocations and frequency use. The graph on this slide shows these changes. Please note that this is not regulatory text, it's just simplified presentation for historical purposes. At the box on the left side, you may see the situation before 2007, and the dominating user of the band 470-862 was broadcasting in the past. Digitalization of broadcasting and anticipation of digital dividend allowed World Radio Communication Conference 2007 to allocate the upper portion of the band, 800 MHz band, to mobile. The subsequent conference 2012 adopted delayed allocation of 700 MHz to mobile service. And WRC-15 confirmed this allocation and introduced condition for sharing between mobile broadcasting and other services. UHF band will be again looked at next conference, WRC-23. Next, please. In fact, the first attempt to consider the low portion of UHF band was made at WRC-15. Not quite successful for region 1, but this conference included the preliminary agenda item for WRC-23 to consider UHF band. At the last conference in Egypt, there was divergent proposals on this agenda item, varying from non-inclusion this agenda item at all, coming from RCC countries to formulating the agenda item as for IMT identification proposed by the Arab group. Compromise solution was reached. It was to include the entire UHF band for 7960, just to understand how this band is used and what are spectrum requirements. But regulatory actions are limited only to the lower part of the band for 7694. And there is no mention in IMT identification in the agenda item. For preparation to this agenda item, ITU study groups are invited to do three things. To analyze spectrum needs of services in the whole band, especially television and mobile service. Perform sharing and compatibility studies between broadcasting and mobile in the low part of the band, and sharing and compatibility analysis to provide protection to other existing services. And the task of the conference is to consider the results of these studies and take regulatory actions in the lowest part of the frequency band for 176.92 in region 1. Next, please. This band is very attractive and sometimes even vital for several services. For broadcasting services, 470-862 is the only globally harmonized band for terrestrial television. And many countries have obligation to provide broadcasting services in this band, and terrestrial broadcasting is sometimes the only means to do it. Digital switchover is now underway. On the left side of this slide, you may see a graph. It comes from ITU DSO, Digital Switchover database. Currently, more than 60% of Region 1 countries already switched to digital television. This transition to digital enables compression of programs, so digital dividend emerges. So it seems that less spectrum is needed for television, but it's not quite correct because less spectrum only for standard definition programs. But digital television offer new services, HD, UHF, 4K, so more spectrum could be needed for television in this band. This band also important for mobile services. IMT needs it to increase coverage of rural and remote areas, and not just to increase coverage by telephony and messaging, but also provide broadband to rural areas. This band is very favorable because good penetration in the building, very favorable propagation conditions, so less number of base stations needed. This solution for IMT is very cost effective. In addition, it can bring new services like machine-to-machine communication, so internet on roads and railways. There are several other services in these bands. A number of RCC countries use aeronautical radio navigation in the part of the band. Radio microphones used by quite many countries in the band, and wind profile radars also used in several countries. Next, please. When studying this agenda item and preparing to the conference, it should be kept in mind that this band is governed by Geneva 06 agreement. So in accordance with agreement, any new television station or IMT or aeronautical radio navigation shall be coordinated through procedure of this agreement. So the next conference has obligation to respect this regulatory mechanism. As for technical consideration or sharing consideration, the previous studies already showed that sharing between IMT and television in the same area is impossible. Two different topologies and ubiquitous coverage of the both systems. It means that every country shall choose either one or the other service. And in addition, if neighboring countries use different services, it may lead to large exclusion zones at the border areas. From the table, you can see that these exclusion zones can reach the range of 160, 180 kilometers. This technical reason led to harmonized rearrangement of 700 and 800 megahertz band starting 2011, 2018 in Europe, in the Arab countries, African countries, and now the same process is going in RCC countries. The objective is to find additional channels for television below 693 megahertz and liberate 700 and 800 for mobile. Europe already finalizing liberation of the both bands, and if other countries follow the same process, it means that in the end, for television, the only band available band will be for 7694. Next slide. To organize the preparation to the conference, a special task group 6.1 was created. It had one meeting. Next meeting will be in July. It created a correspondence group on background section in the CPM report. The organization structure this group you can see there. And in the preparation to these studies, participants of studies can keep in the mind several elements. As for spectrum needs, proponents of all services should come up with quite sound frequency requirements. As for studies, participants again in the study groups may consider possible reuse of the previous UHF sharing studies, not big difference between 700 and 600 megahertz band. And studies can also may have a look at the efficiency of spectrum use. For example, if the current FD channeling arrangement is efficient, or other channeling schemes can be used. And of course, the conference should not forget about the protection of existing service, which is a must of every radio communication conference. In this way, this golden band could be used in the most efficient way. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, Nikolai. I think that's really useful to set the scene for the rest of our panelists. So thank you very much for your time in coming and making the presentation today. Much appreciated. If we now move on to the next section of the webinar. So our next session is a session entitled State Your Case, where we will have 4 different speakers from industry outlining different industry positions, setting out some of their key thoughts on future use of the band. We have 2 speakers who will predominantly speak from the mobile industry perspective and 2 from the broadcast industry perspective. Starting off, giving us a mobile industry view, we have Glyn Carter, who's a senior spectrum advisor at the GSMA. Glyn, you have around 7 minutes to make your introductory remarks. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Well, hello everyone, and my name is Glyn Carter, and I'm going to say a few words about why UHF spectrum and WRC-23 agenda item 1.5 is important for the future of mobile. Next slide, please. WRC-23 can have an important role in increasing coverage and capacity and reducing the cost of mobile. 5G can bring many benefits, but there is a risk that people without access to mobile broadband may become marginalized or disadvantaged. Wide area spectrum that is being discussed at WRC-23 can bring opportunities to expand digital inclusion. Approximately 90% of the world's population is covered by mobile broadband, but around 50% are not connected to mobile broadband due to barriers, for example, cost. Next slide, please. So why more UHF spectrum for mobile? There are a number of reasons for this. This spectrum can bring increased capacity and performance to rural areas and other hard to reach places, and therefore can help to reduce the digital divide. The UHF spectrum can also lead to increased reliability and consistent user experience, which is very important for mobile broadband and also for other services. And it can also support new applications and use cases, for example, IoT and road transport applications. Next slide, please. With regard to the frequency range 470 to 694 megahertz that has been studied under Agenda Item 1.5, it is clear that there are different and varying situations in different countries and regions, and that these countries and regions have different situations and needs with regard to this spectrum. For example, in terms of market demand and development, both for mobile and for other services, such as DTT. A primary mobile allocation at WRC-23 can provide flexibility to enable this UHF spectrum to be used efficiently according to the future needs in different parts of Region 1 and the rest of the world. And furthermore, a IMT identification could potentially encourage harmonization between countries that wish to use this spectrum for IMT. Final slide, please. So in conclusion, a mobile allocation at WRC-23 in the UHF spectrum can provide flexibility to support greater wide area capacity and affordable mobile broadband. This can lead to a number of benefits, for example, in terms of digital equality and inclusion, in terms of affordable and consistent user experience, in terms of support for new services and applications, and in terms of social and economic development. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Glyn. Thanks very much. We'll engage in questions later when we get to the panel session with the rest of the speakers, but for now I'll move straight on to our next speaker. So now giving us a broadcast industry perspective, we have Elena from the Technology and Innovation Unit of the EBU coming to us from Geneva. Over to you, Elena.
Thank you very much, Mark, and hello to everybody, wherever you are. So as Mark said, I represent the European Broadcasting Union. Today, my presentation will be on how to foster innovation in the UHF band. Next slide, please. So the EBU represents public service media in the European broadcasting area, more than 150 organizations across the area. And our mission, I think, is the most important thing that I want to start my presentation with. Next slide, please. And this is the key role that DTT plays for our society. My colleague Jean-Pierre will provide other numbers of the importance of DTT for the society, for the population. But I would like to highlight one thing here for public service media is that we have a mission that is set by law, which consists in delivering content and services of utmost quality to inform, educate, and entertain every citizen wherever they are. So every citizen wherever they are. So to deliver this universal service obligation, DTT and the UHF band remains really key because it's really efficient to deliver linear services to very large audiences for its near universal reach, because it's free to air, and because it's resilience in times of crisis. Today, no other platform that in its own can offer the same public value to the society. Next slide, please. But of course, we need to move on. And if linear television is very important, we also know that the audience trends is really changing and is really evolving. And we see that with the on-demand content that is increasing every year by 1 or 2%. So we see that already we have addressed this in the big TV screens with the smart TVs that are connected to the internet and where you can get your on-demand content if you want. But we need to address the rest of the devices that the family is looking at it. And this is all the mobile devices, the smartphones and tablets, which mainly is the young audience where they are there. So to address this, we have the 5G broadcast technology, which is a new technology which its main purpose is to deliver our content to those devices. Broadcasters, we have addressed that in 3GPP, and we have tried to include our public service media requirements, and in particular, now the 5G broadcast standard includes a receive-only mode, a SIM-free mode, which is very important for public service media. Next slide, please. So we have done a lot of trials with 5G broadcast. I only mention here the last two ones that we have done recently, the one in Vienna, where ORS group tested many configurations, in particular high tower, with medium tower, and also with content over global networks. We also have the ongoing trial in Stuttgart, the 5G Media to Go trial that is led by our member SWR, and the objective is media consumption in autonomously driving cars. So as you can see, very future-looking projects. To highlight here that we have different types of reception modes. These mobile devices could be stationary or could be in a mobile environment. And for this, we have realized in these trials that we may need different layer network structures to cover both. Also, another important element of these trials is the product maturity. So we have realized that there are a lot of undergoing products that are being developed at both a chipset terminal and also transmitter level. Very important, we learned this week that one mobile manufacturer will start producing mobile phones, smartphones, that it will include release 16 with 5G broadcast. So it really is a good step forward to start looking to the implementation. Next slide, please. So when implementing 5G broadcast, we have already the standard, is the ETSI standard, is the LTE-based 5G terrestrial broadcast system. To remember that it's a downlink technology, it means that it's a signal from the transmitter to the user, and it does not require an uplink. An uplink means a signal from the user device to the transmitter. So very clear, only downlink technology. The channel raster, so the channel raster is currently 5 at 10 megahertz, linked to the current LTE, some of the LTE channel rasters, but we are working to try to include in the next releases the 6, 7, and 8 megahertz channel rasters to be more aligned with the broadcasters channel rasters for television. And the network, we have made changes to the release 16 for this 5G broadcast configuration to include high power, high tower, medium power, and medium tower, in addition to the low power, low tower, because as I said, we need certain combinations to obtain optimal coverage. And the frequency bands, well, UHF is the obvious frequency band that we need, but potentially also the bands that are allocated to supplement and downlink. Next slide, please. So looking to the UHF band, I think it's quite important that 5G broadcast in the UHF band will be innovation and flexibility, both things at the same time. Why? As I said, 5G broadcast is a new downlink-only technology that guarantees compatibility with DTT and PMSC, because the band, very importantly, is also used by wireless audio devices for content production. So 5G broadcast does not require uplink in the same frequency band, and as mentioned by Nikolai, this is the main handicap of trying to share the spectrum between mobile and broadcasting services. Is the uplink that creates a problem because it's interfered by DTT. In this case, we don't need uplink, it's just a downlink technology and is compatible with DTT and PMSC. From a regulatory point of view, it can be introduced in the UHF band under the Geneva 6 agreement. Also, as mentioned by Nikolai, the agreement includes the regulatory procedures to introduce other services than just DVB-T or DVB-T2. Of course, we need to respect the DTT spectrum mask, and we need to respect the DTT APFD limits. But the regulation is there to allow this introduction of 5G broadcast. From a technical point of view, there is also one thing that we still need to solve, and this is adjacent channel interference to DTT. This needs to be addressed at national level. Very important that what some regulators are looking for is a co-primary allocation. This would be for a traditional FDD. This is not technically compatible with DTT. This would require DTT and PMSC and also the core innovation to stop. This is not flexibility. This is just one configuration for one country imposing to the other country. So just to finish with my last slide, when talking about the future of the UHF band, it's very important to remember that today DTT and the UHF band provides public value to the society and will stay in many countries for a long time together with PMSC use. Regulators, when they're trying to define the future use of the UHF band, they need to consider the societal value that new users can generate, and not only the economic value. So the real value of 5G that 5G can generate is, I think, is in the verticals. If 5G remains the same as 4G, it will not add much incremental value compared to what we have today with 4G, that with the current values under 1 GHz in the UHF band already provides good capacity and reliability. 5G broadcast is a key 5G vertical for the media ecosystem that can generate societal value to the UHF band, which is the only one which could satisfy the requirements of 5G broadcast. It can be introduced in the UHF band under the Geneva 6 agreement and therefore be technically compatible with DTT and PMSC, offering the possibility to different countries have different solutions, means providing real flexibility. So to summarize, innovation and flexibility in the UHF band do not require changes in the ITU regulations at WRC-23. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks very much, Elena. It's very interesting. And we'll pick up on some of those points, I'm sure, in the panel session. Now, hopping back to get another mobile industry perspective, our next speaker is Ulrich Refus, who's the low band global lead at GSA. Uli, over to you.
Thank you very much, Mark, and good day to everyone here on the webinar. Interesting topic today, I guess. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. So GSA represents the supply industry to the mobile ecosystem, and we've been around since 1998 and believe to provide quite some intelligence like this device database on Gambot and so forth. So on the next slide, please, you see some 5G use cases which have been seen, I guess, before. The point I want to stress is the rural in red. So I think people really expect the services not to only work in cities where higher bands can provide the respective performance, but that they need to extend into the rural areas, be consistent across a country, across a region. So if we move on to the next slide, you see these distinct roles that we see of low band, mid band, high band spectrum. So certainly there are many megahertzes available in mid bands and high bands and will be needed for covering and providing the capacity to the more populated areas. But there is a very important role to cost efficiently provide the same services in the wide areas, typically on existing grids. So there's a huge cost impact which can be avoided by having sufficient low band capacity in these rural areas. And this cost impact certainly has an implication on the consumer as well. It's not only saving operators money, it's really enabling affordable services to the end consumers also in the rural areas. So if we go to the next slide, we clearly see a need for flexibility below 700 megahertz in the ITU region 1. So clearly we see a need to add additional bandwidth, and that also applies specifically in ITU region 1 to the existing networks in order to cope with what we see as demand arising, both for, let's say, more traditional enhanced mobile broadband services, but also what comes on top as new services in the IoT domain in terms of connected cars and so forth. And we also have to recognize that there is an existing 600 megahertz FDD 3GPP band, 71 for 4G and N71 for 5G, which is today supported in infrastructure products and as well in terminals. I guess most of the terminals that we have in our pockets today already support that band. So there is, let's say, a temptation to immediately use that and have cost-efficient improvements on the 4G or 5G networks. And we see that mainly, certainly, as shown by Mark in the beginning, in the Americas, but also now other countries around the globe looking into that. And in ITU region, specifically the Arab region, and I guess we'll hear a bit more about that later on today. On the other hand, as outlined by Elena and also in the ITU presentation, there are certainly issues that the band cannot be easily released. So that varies a lot. And I think that translates into a certain need for flexibility. So we also see that administrations have different targets. Not only, let's say, between sub-regions, even neighboring countries. If you look at Switzerland, for instance, having switched off DTT entirely, with a neighbor country, Italy, using DTT very massively. So we somehow have to cater for these very different target settings of different administrations. So we believe that we need to study a number of options in terms of band plans, and that is not necessarily, or maybe not even at all, the task of the WRC, where we indeed talk about a regulatory change or no change in terms of adding a co-primary mobile allocation. But I think these band plan discussions somehow may help to understand what we are talking about and where flexibility could be added. So if we go to the next slide, a few recommendations, let's say initial recommendations from a GSA perspective. So we see that evolution of both broadcast and mobile, and Elena has nicely outlined what happens in terms of 5G broadcast considerations on the broadcast side. I would say including these thoughts of complementing high power, high tower infrastructure with more macrocellular or gap filler infrastructure, as it may be called in broadcast terms, in terms to really provide mobile coverage, not only fixed rooftop reception, but mobile devices. So we see that technology evolving and possibly converging, which should then lead to some integration and more closely working together. we believe that a co-primary mobile allocation will be hugely important for that evolution path to happen, mainly looking at the device ecosystem. Finally, these ecosystems, I think, would not only be driven from a broadcast side. If broadcast receivers are desired in phones, they would also need the push and the pull, let's say, from the mobile operator community to really look into, let's say, joining the efforts and justifying the efforts to bring such an ecosystem to life. So we believe that co-primary mobile allocation can provide the future flexibility. I wouldn't do the math that had been on one of Elena's slides in terms of saying co-primary equals protection for uplink, which indeed is the coexistence challenge. So co-primary, I think, should be really considered in a wider term. So we would see that co-primary mobile allocation really provide administrations with the flexibility to look into what is best for their country, for their sub-region, certainly in coordination with their neighbors and respecting existing arrangements where necessary. So we'd even favor an IMT footnote that may not come as a surprise from the mobile supplier community to enable that ecosystem, which requires certain global scale. And then we recognize that there is a number of duplex arrangements discussed. So certainly FDD and TDD both would require uplink, which makes them challenging, whereas supplemental downlink configurations could coexist much easier, as also shown on Nick's slide earlier on. So these should be studied after the World Radio Conference, building on a co-primary mobile allocation and IMT footnote that we would want to achieve in WRC-23. Thanks very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Uli. Excellent. We'll move on now to our final panelist for the State Your Case Industry Positions section. So lastly, we have Jean-Pierre Fessin, who is Vice Chairman at Broadcast Networks Europe. Take it away, Jean-Pierre.
Thank you very much, Mark. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone at this seminar. ITU's focus is to develop harmonization in order to enhance connectivity. Terrestrial television broadcasting is, in that respect, a wonderful success, and we will argue that it is the current regulatory framework allows it to foster and to prepare for the future. I represent Broadcast Networks Europe, the trade association for transmission services providers on behalf of the TV and radio channels. We operate in Europe, but in most of the information I will try to give also a region one and sometimes a worldwide perspective. Let's first take a look at the current situation, whether we are already in a situation which is harmonized. Next slide, please. We can see on this map that digital terrestrial television is a worldwide and region one success. This is clear. This is based on harmonized technologies. The spectrum is used widely and in some sub-regions extremely highly. For instance, digital terrestrial television is present in 250 million for 250 million citizens in Europe. Also very important is that the spectrum is used in a shared way, that is, for instance, PMSC, other TV white space devices, and also radio astronomy can use the spectrum. So this is both used, sharing efficiently, and extremely well spread across the region one and the world. Now, this is a picture now. Of course, in the debates we have also to look at the future. So let's take a look at the dynamic in the next slide, please. What we see on this chart is that each year there are new countries which launch DTT. Namely, since 2016, 31 new countries have launched a DTT project. 21 in region 1. And of course, when you do that, this is a long-term investment because it may take maybe 5, maybe more years to roll out the network. And then you would expect it to run for 15 to 20 years. So we are really looking at a long investment to the future. Also, it's not only new countries launching DTT, but also countries which have established it for a while. They're renovating it because, of course, the platform is not frozen. It has to evolve. There is competition between the various platforms to distribute television. And of course, innovation is key for that. So many new, more spectrum efficient technologies have been introduced. Many countries have completed the transition to DVB-T2, and this with offering improved service to the consumer, whether it is high definition television, hybrid television, and in the future, Ultra HD television. We have also heard Elena from the EBU showing that our customers are also looking at new ways to deliver broadcasting to mobile systems and in a way that respect their public service requirements. And of course, we are very interested in that. And the fundamental behind that is there is still a very strong usage for linear television. Of course, there are other ways to watch television and to watch video. This is clear. But linear television remains an essential usage, extremely resilient. And in terms of COVID, for instance, we've seen the increase in audience. But even before COVID, still in Europe, for instance, average viewing per day was 303 hours and 30 minutes, which is a lot. So we have the picture, we have the evolution. So in the next slide, we'll see that this converged into a very consistent vision. Harmonization, strong dynamics, while we have the answers of the countries at the to the ITU questions. How much spectrum do you need for digital terrestrial television in the future? The answer is at least 224 megahertz, that is the band 476, 94 megahertz at least. That is for 94 countries in region 1. So this is an overwhelming majority and very consistent with the two previous elements I showed. So let's see in the next slide what regulatory framework is best adapted to serve that vision. In our view, for the foreseeable future, the existing framework is optimal. Why? Because first, we have to realize, and this has been said, that the remaining 476, 94 megahertz spectrum is the only remaining spectrum for terrestrial television. Without that, DTT cannot operate and exist, let alone innovate. And this has been recognized, for instance, in the EU law, which secures that band for the long term. Also, we've heard that there is a need for flexibility. Co-primary is not necessary for introducing new services in some countries that want to do so, provided, of course, that they respect certain constraints, which are in GO6, in the UHF decision, and elsewhere. So it is possible to do it, and actually there is evidence that this has been done. Co-primary is not a necessity. However, there is ample evidence and history, and this has also been recalled by Mark and Nikolai, that the tendency once the spectrum has been identified for IMT is that in the end, this is eviction. So we're not talking about flexibility. We're talking about eviction of the futures of the spectrum for the digital terrestrial television. In conclusion, and that will be my last slide, 476-94 megahertz is the core remaining spectrum for modern digital terrestrial television. And it is the basis for ongoing and planned investment in region 1 and also for further innovations such as 5G broadcast. So the key for WRC-23 in our view is the regulatory stability for that band. And the benefit, and not only to us, of course, but to the general interest, is to ensure universal access to free television, news and entertainment, bringing business, social, cultural, and sovereignty benefits. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jean-Pierre. We'll come back to you and all of the other industry speakers shortly, but first we move on to the response from regulators, where we have a selection of 4 regulators from across different parts of Region 1 who will be providing some of their views, both on what they've just heard, but also their own thinking on some of the key issues. First up, we have Jonas Wessel, who's from the Swedish regulator, PTS. Over to you, Jonas.
Thank you very much, Mark, and thank you to all our previous presenters. Well done on stating your case. I'm not here to be the judge, not here to sort of say who did the best thing. I would just want to start by actually pondering for a few minutes on the dilemma of being a national spectrum manager. Spectrum is a very valuable but limited natural resource, and it should be used wisely. In one way, to maximize the societal or socioeconomic benefit to consumers, to countries, and to markets over time. So as we've heard over the last presentations, how this societal value is achieved depends on who the interpreter of that societal value is. And as we've heard from our industry representatives, in all honesty, I think that they actually are right, all of them. And that comes to the dilemma of being a spectrum manager. Spectrum is limited, i.e. you can't just take spectrum and give to things that sound good. And since many years in Europe, we have been leaning towards the service and technology neutral way of managing spectrum. In the IT world, one can say that that has had, up to today, limited success. So thus, we're standing here with the big question on what services that should be protected at national borders. We end up with a battle of networks or a battle of technologies. Did the mobile side take the best arguments or the broadcasting side? I think that one really has to sort of lean back and ponder on the issues, because what we lack in this discussion is actually, what does the consumers want? Because both mobile networks today and broadcasting networks today provide content. They provide services, moving images, all of these wonderful things that our media production companies and our cultural sector are developing throughout the world. And these networks, they only send that out to people to enjoy. And I think we need to start that. What we hear from different industry representatives are really arguments on how can we replace or protect, enable or disable, how can we create the benefit for the digital divide or protect the investment, etc. But I think that it is important that these issues should actually boil down to, I would say, 3 topics. Most importantly, consumer demand. Where are the viewers going? What platforms are they on, and how are they consuming media today and tomorrow? Second, I would say, is the willingness to invest in networks and in coverage and in providing services, no matter the technology. Thirdly, and not leastly, is the political will. And as been said by many in this previous session, Region 1 is not one market. I would say Europe is not a market, and I wouldn't say that Sweden is a market either when it comes to that. There are different demands in different regions, and we're moving at different paces. So consumer demand is different, the willingness to invest is different, and the political wills is different. And also, as we've heard, the use of this piece of spectrum is very different in different parts of the world. And I know that we'll have a presentation on how to proceed with a 600 band in parts of Region 1, which is interesting. I think that in order to really look at how to maximize societal value, we need to create the preconditions for different solutions. And now, speaking as a Swedish regulator on this, I said this has led us to a situation where we're aiming for a co-primary mobile allocation for the band at WRC-23. This does not mean that we are about to introduce mobile services by a certain date. We have a well-functioning broadcasting situation in Sweden, and that will last at least until 2027. and probably longer than that. But what we want to see is that when such a decision is taken in Sweden, eventually, we need to have the full picture on how to sort of respond to societal value, consumer demand, willingness to invest, and the political will. So, and all of those issues will not be resolved at WRC-23. So I think that, just to state that case, I think that it is important to see how to enable different coexistence of different scenarios for the future. So I think I'll stop there and come back later. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jonas. Next, we have a Middle Eastern perspective from Mohammed Al-Shnoubi, who's at the CITC, the regulator in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, perhaps able to tell us something about plans for the 600 megahertz band there.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you also to Forum Global of having us to speak in this conference about the UHF band. I will be speaking on behalf of my dear colleague Omar Salik, who couldn't be here today as his father passed away 2 days ago. Our warm condolences to him and to his family. I will be sharing in this 5-minute talk his thoughts on the utilization of UHF in the Middle East, as well as the direction in Saudi Arabia of how to reallocate and to use the band from 470 to 694. Well, in the beginning, I will be talking about the UHF in general, as my dear colleague Jonas from Sweden mentioned, that the mandate of spectrum regulators is to ensure best utilization of spectrum. And when we talk about UHF, we talk about, from physics point of view, very, very valuable area of the spectrum plan, which can provide too many radio surfaces and cover large areas with different surfaces, either mobile broadcasting or different kind of surfaces. Now, if we see how the band utilized in the region, in Middle East and in Saudi Arabia in particular, the situation and the case in the region, in Middle East region, is not as Europe in terms of DTT deployment. What the number talks is there is very limited utilizing of the band for TV broadcasting. We talk about, in Saudi Arabia, we talk about 98% of households having TV, only 1% of them relying on the DTT technologies, as here in Saudi Arabia and also in the region, we rely more in satellite broadcasting, and then as well as on the new, I could say, digitized solutions of streaming the media such as Netflix, HBO, and etc. So in terms of utilization, the utilization of DTT is very low comparing to other region-wide part such as Europe. When we talk about the mobile need here in the kingdom, we talk about a huge need for having from the mobile operator here in the kingdom for having more spectrum to provide IMT and mobile applications. In the last 3 to 4 years, we in Saudi Arabia hold 4 spectrum auction in UHF bands and also in mid bands in 700, 800, 900, as well as some of the mid band spectrum in 2.3, 2.6, and 3.5. This the injection of this spectrum has led to massive increase of the internet speed in the kingdom. As we stand right now, the 5th worldwide in speed test ranking, while the situation was not, we were 50 or something like that 4 years ago in this ranking. So there is a need to provide or to have more spectrum to provide digital connectivity and mobile connectivity in the kingdom. as Saudi Arabia as well, very large area. We have too many villages and rural areas, and it is very important to bridge the digital divide. And for sure, when we talk about UHF and physical characteristics of UHF, it is a great solution to that. When we talk internationally, as the colleagues has mentioned, especially the colleague from the ITU and others as well, we have the WRC-23 agenda item 1.5, which consider the reallocation of the 600 megahertz here in Saudi Arabia. We would love to see the band co-allocated with broadcasting services for mobile and identified for IMT. We think for sure there will be massive coordination with the other countries in Region 1, but we think there is a good chance to have this allocation coming for the next conference. Now, what we did in Saudi Arabia, starting from 2020, we have established our initiative for commercial and innovative use of spectrum, and by this initiative, we plan to inject different and many spectrum bands to provide different kind of digital services to provide to enhance the mobile services, and to as well enable other kind of commercial services in the kingdom. According to this initiative, we have launched, or we have published our draft outlook last January, and the draft outlook was on consultation. We have received the consultation or responses from different internal and external stakeholders. We expect very soon to publish our final outlook in the first quarter of 2021. According to this outlook, we plan to reallocate the 2000 to the 600 megahertz band, to have it co-allocated with the broadcasting services, and as well as we plan to auction the band during the year to provide mobile connectivity as some other North American countries. By this auction and this plan, we also plan to adopt the same channel plans that used currently in the North American countries, which is the FDD channel plan using 2 by 35 megahertz, 2 by 35 megahertz channel bandwidth FDD using the FDD duplexing. As the band, currently growing, and there is ecosystem growth in the band following this channeling arrangement. With this, I conclude my introduction and our views on the 600 megahertz. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much, Mohammed. Some very interesting points that I'll be keen to pick up on in the session after everybody's spoken. If I could now, though, introduce our next speaker. So speaking next, coming from the Ugandan Communications Commission, we have Irene Kagwa Sevankambo. Irene, over to you.
Thank you, Mark, and good afternoon, good evening, or good morning from whichever side of the planet you are participating in this. Firstly, thank you to the organizers for inviting us to be a part of this, and to the persons who've spoken before me in terms of presenting the industry perspective and the different regional perspectives. Of course, as a regulator, we all tend to have similar challenges. And of course, as I was listening and I was thinking, okay, Sweden, Uganda, Czech, very similar perspectives. From the African continent, I would say TV broadcasting is still very prevalent. There was mention about what do people want? They want information, but due to historical and also social and economic status, many people still use mainly radio and television for their broadcasting services. The different countries around the continent are all at different levels of implementation of the analog to digital switchover. So you find that in a number of countries, you still have operations, analog operations going on, whereas in other countries, they've been successful in achieving the digital migration. And the reasons for these have already been mentioned by my colleagues. They range from the cost, because in many cases, this has to be done by the government broadcaster, which is normally struggling in terms of sustainability and funding. So in many countries, the financing of this exercise has really hampered the successful migration and the timely migration as well. And in the other cases, it's a political will, appreciation of why should we, and the value that accrues from the switchover, does it match that? Of course, as Uganda, were one of the countries that managed to achieve this migration and freed up the spectrum for mobile services. Now, as all of us, as the rest of the regulator colleagues also mentioned, we in Africa also would wish to have more efficient, cost-effective technologies on the market and available as we continue on our quest of bringing more persons on board in terms of broadband connectivity. We are all speaking in terms of inclusion, and we know affordability is a key issue. For, of course, historical reasons, most of Africa has very low fixed connectivity, with wireless systems being most prevalent in terms of broadband connectivity. So, of course, broadband services are a very key issue to us. Now, looking at the importance and the, for many of us, it was a major pushback on why we then agreed as a country on behalf of our nationals to conduct that digital migration, because to the actual citizens that should be benefiting from this, it seemed a bother or a disadvantage because of cost. There was the network side of it, but there was also a consumer side of it or a viewer side of it, where they would need to get different devices, set-top boxes, and the cost of this was a significant issue for many of our citizens. So we've been quite cagey and nervous about having to take them through another migration, whether from the side of the operators or from the side of the consumers. So we are happy to note that what is being studied in respect of WRC-23 is the sharing and whether indeed there's compatibility. We all know that the sensitivities around the broadcasting services and the extra protection that comes with them. So we are eager to know the results, follow and participate in this, and be able to see whether indeed we can accommodate them within the band, and under what arrangements then if indeed they can share the range. In interest of time, I will just conclude by saying that for many of us, the promise vis-a-vis the reality is an issue that always comes up. We keep promising cheaper technologies, but we see the industry instead using this spectrum that gets freed up for the newer technologies, and the benefits coming out down to the lower side of the pyramid are not always obvious. So thank you very much. I'll leave it there for now and wait for any questions.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Irene. Now, if I introduce our final speaker, last but not least, we have Andrei Lashkevich, who's Deputy Head of Department at the Radio Research and Development Institute in Russia. Andrei, over to you.
Good evening, everybody, or good morning. I just speaking on behalf of Scientific Institute in Russian Federation, and we have to cover the issue of the relevant discussion question here for the maybe RCC countries firstly, because the RCC countries is not on a position yet to declare its final proposal from this agenda item with respect to WRC-23. But nevertheless, we have to cover, to investigate our position, most important things. One thing is the existing situation. The existing situation is the following. The terrestrial broadcasting is the most important social part of communication infrastructure in the very big part of our countries, especially in Russia, which I'm authorized to speak for. And this requires a very small investment to cover a large territory. That's a very important thing to understand. With respect to modern upcoming mobile communication technology, yes, it's okay. It may provide additional features and so on and so forth. But for a moment, at least for a moment, it requires such kind of technology requires much more investment with respect to the conventional broadcasting linear television systems. So this case is not open and is still open, not answered properly up to today. To answer how, for example, imagine the Russia territory. It's a huge, space with sometimes very low population density. How to cover this with modern telecommunication services, taking into account the very limited, household budget for telecommunication services per month in many regions. It's actually below maybe $10, maybe $5. It's not very big, amount of money, and the population not in a position to update the telecommunication systems and to cover new technology in comms and and to help for mobile operators to take money from in response to their investment in these particular cases. So it's creates some principal difficulty to for successful penetration of new telecommunication services in a big extent for big countries like in Russia. So in that case, we have still no answer how to it's planned to help to replace, for example, broadcasting services if we speak about this kind of flexibility. So for that case, we have to study the broadcasting requirements and the mobile requirements. The broadcasting requirements now is growing because of the going to the world of high definition television and ultra high definition television, and also we have to think about non-linear services representation within the broadcasting service itself. And another thing is the mobile service demand in this particular frequency band, and we still have not seen any particular study with respect to that, indicating that this is absolutely necessary to mobile for mobile to involve. So it's a mixed situation, and we have no clear answers up to the moment. And the only thing that we can indicate now, that these particular frequency bands below 700 megahertz band is very well occupied by the existing services, and also this occupation just tends to increase because some countries around Russia will have to reallocate broadcasting from 700 megahertz band to frequency bands below. And maybe in Russia will also maybe done this in future, but we still know the position to do so at the moment. So that particular issue will just create an extremely high difficulty in allocation of some particular additional services in this frequency band below 700 megahertz band. And for us, it's critical in second aspect. If you establish non-clear future plans as a regulator, you have to provide the confusion and the mess on the investment market. There's no clear indication where to go. So it confuses everybody. So we really believe we should provide a clear as regulators or as common society, telecommunication society. We have to provide a very clear answer for telecommunication community, broadcasting community, how to deal with this issue. We should not stay in the mixed and unclear and not predictable position, indicating that maybe yes, maybe no, maybe the inspector go in this service, maybe the inspector will go in other services. I believe we should prepare a clear answer. And for the moment, I don't see enough, reasons to seriously think about the reallocation of this frequency spectrum from existing mobile broadcasting services to some new services. But maybe in future the situation will change, but for a moment it's very clear. And the last thing is the usage and the sharing and the co-allocation of the services. We already indicated a lot of problems with respect to the providing electromagnetic compatibility between the mobile services, the common mobile services itself, in this common form, look like the uplink and downlink and so on and so forth, and the common form broadcasting service, because the broadcasting service is common format is very tightly related to the clarity of a frequency spectrum, the availability of low noise frequency spectrum. And if you put, some mobile infrastructure around the broadcasting infrastructure, there is serious cases of compatibility. So we still have to answer on these particular questions, and this difficulties or cause big limits, increasing limits of possible usage of mobile services within these frequency bands below 694 megahertz. But the other options which just proposed by the EBU in this particular seminar, it's the interesting one. It deals with the 5G broadcast option with HPHT infrastructure usage, and it may be studied more carefully. And I believe it could provide the answer what is flexibility should look like as a whole. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrei, and thank you to all our speakers for initial contributions. We're now going to move into an interactive session with discussion amongst our panelists. So I think Dan is in the process of bringing everyone back onto screen, which I hope you can also see at home. In this session, we're going to have a few questions posed from panelists to other panelists, and also there's a few things that I wanted to ask, picking up on some of what was said during those last pair of sessions. Perhaps if I can start with a question for you, Jonas. Just picking up on a couple of things that you said. I think you were moving towards giving the Swedish position on aiming for a co-primary allocation, although noting that didn't necessarily mean DTT switch off anytime soon. I was intrigued that the date you mentioned there was until at least 2027 rather than 2030. So perhaps you could elaborate on that. And secondly, noting that you also have a role in the RSPG. So I was wondering if you could maybe also give us the RSPG position on this agenda item, or where it's heading.
Thank you very much, Mark. Yes. Well, the date 2027 is very simple, because that's the length or duration of the current broadcasting licenses in Sweden, which is a purely national issue because we issued the licenses and they will be ending in 2027. In due time before that, there will be new political decisions on the future of that. And that's what I mean by the political decision. So no sort of relation to UHF decisions or any other dates. It's really just sort of licenses or expiring by that date. Just a few words on the RSPG level. As many of you might know, we issued a public consultation for a new RSPP program on European level. For those who have looked into that, you saw very little on the UHF band or sort of the future of broadcasting. We left much of that out. There are a few mentions of that, but just to sort of put it in perspective, the RSPG is also working on providing a draft opinion on views in the work upcoming to WRC-23, and that work is still sort of ongoing. So we have refrained from saying much about that. But to be honest, it is a difficult question. And there are very different paces in Europe, and I think that this panel has provided that. So we'll keep you in the unknown on where the RSPG is going on that. Thank you.
Thanks, Jonas. Great. I think what would perhaps be useful is to move on to thinking about co-primary. And I think, Uli, in this respect, you had a question for some of the other panelists.
Yeah, so the question is, can we come to more cooperative models than in the past, where I think we have to acknowledge that co-primary mobile meant clearance of 800 and then meant clearance of 700. How could we build certain trust that there is more to win, maybe for all players when joining forces, doing things together, working towards common ecosystems? for instance, a receiver for 7694 in phones that can be used then flexibly for what it's needed. And I think also in what direction media is going IP. There always will be a linear portion for sports, for certain events, but the non-linear part, I think, is growing. So I think we should more think in terms of how can we build flexible systems, maybe starting with flexible spectrum use to really accommodate what we have 5 and 10 years down the road by parameter setting of a system rather than spectrum decisions in a WRC. So, but maybe this key question: how could we build certain trust on, going more cooperative paths in 47694?
Great. Elena, Jean-Pierre, does one of you want to comment?
Well, I think it's a difficult question. I mean, as you said, Uli, making a co-primary allocation so far has meant to stop DTT and PMSC in 700 and 800. So how can we build trust? Difficult question, but we are trying for the time being to keep the primary allocation apart. I think from the broadcaster's point of view, we are trying to engage on LTE technologies. We are trying to engage on 5G technologies to see, as I said, where the media is going. It's going to where our audience is, and what is growing is non-linear TV consumption, and it's in the mobile devices. So we need to work, as you said, with the mobile industry. We are doing all our efforts. We are contributing to 3GPP. We are doing trials. We are investing money. I think we are doing already that, which I think is a good step forward. I think we need to continue collaboration, and I think with you, with the manufacturers, I think is very important, because then if we have the equipment ready, we can start implementing. But let's keep, for example, the spectrum for the time being apart. I mean, if we are investing in 5G broadcast, it's a mobile technology, but it's still for delivering broadcast content. Let's keep the spectrum for broadcasting and use this spectrum together with the mobile industry. I mean, we can do also the other way around. I mean, why not to add a broadcast allocation to the mobile allocations? We are also interested in SDL, for example, in SDL allocations. Can we do the opposite? I mean, I don't think it would make sense. So I think we need to collaborate from the technical point of view and see how we can build business models. Also, business models is an issue, I think. I don't know, Jean-Pierre, maybe you want to add something.
No, I fully subscribe to what you said. I think part of the trust is actually being built by being together in some fora. I think, for instance, 5G MAG or other things, technical work, this is clear. However, to give an example of how trust is not so well established is the day after the auctions in the USA. There was a lot of communication explaining how it would be sold in Europe, which was about exactly the same time when there was the UHF decision, which was securing the 600 megahertz band and lower for broadcasting. So I think it's very important to listen to what has been decided also by the Council, by the Parliament, and by the European people, and to take that as an input before trying to engage in forcing a different element. For instance, there is in the UHF decision some elements about flexibility, but we have not seen much work on it being actually implemented.
Jean-Pierre, I think you were mentioning as well in your opening remarks that actually a co-primary allocation might not be necessary in order for some mobile use in the bands, assuming that there's no claims of protection from interference being made, for example. I don't know if Glyn or Uli have a view on how necessary co-primary allocation is in that context.
Yeah, if I may. Well, I'm more a technical guy than a legal guy. So there probably is a legal domain where exactly you draw the line between a broadcast service and a mobile service. So when we talk about mobile devices, when we talk a mix of linear and non-linear content, I think we're getting very close to mobile. Anyhow, if we're talking about convergence, this borderline will blur at some stage. I think why even for broadcast a co-primary mobile allocation could be of interest is really the ecosystem perspective. Finally, you need a visibility on hundreds of millions of devices being capable of being sold in certain markets with a certain vision. And I think a co-primary mobile allocation would give a clear signal to all the chip makers, to the handset makers, that there is a relevant band, which is then useful both for broadcast and for mobile. Whereas if it's a purely mobile play with maybe even a limited number of countries looking into 5G broadcast deployments, it will be very difficult to get that ecosystem momentum. So I guess that's one important consideration, keeping in mind these global ecosystem sizes that are required. So 600 megahertz obviously has that ecosystem already. How do we get visibility for an ecosystem other than that, going also a cooperative path?
Thank you.
If I can come in also, it's Glyn here.
Sure. Yeah, please do.
Yeah. So yeah, let me try and answer as best I can. I mean, so it's clear that broadcasting in UHF is important and very important in some countries, and it's clear that in some countries DTT will continue and continues to be important for some years. However, it's also so we can argue as well about when does broadcasting become mobile and where is the overlap between them. And I guess 5G broadcast is somewhere on the edge between the two. However, it's also clear that in some countries, and we heard from one or two of them earlier in this session, they want to be able to use the spectrum for other uses because of their situations, because of their much less dependence on DTT. And it seems to me to be, however things evolve in different countries in the future, it seems to me to be sensible to give the ability to be able to do that. For example, in Saudi Arabia, to be able to use the spectrum in the way they wish to, without doing that outside the ITU, because otherwise you are saying, we don't recognize these other uses that some countries wish to adopt in the band, therefore, what's the meaning of these allocations in the radio regulations if some countries have to go outside the radio regulations in order to do what their country wishes to do in order to meet their national needs?
Yeah.
Maybe that gives a partial answer. Thanks.
No, thank you, Glyn. That's an interesting point. I was about to say I'd like to get a regulatory perspective on this from some of the regulators. So perhaps we could start with Mohammed here, if you've got a view, particularly in the context of what Saudi Arabia is doing in the 600 band.
Well, I will start with sentence that my dear colleague from Sweden, Jonas, mentioned, that we have different demand in different region. So the demand is totally different for services, either for mobile or for broadcasting in our region than in Europe. Same thing when we're talking about utilization of the band. We have, as I mentioned in my talk, very, very low utilization of broadcasting comparing with Europe. We have as well larger countries and less developed, probably border areas comparing with Europe, where too many cities coming at the borders. So and also countries such as Saudi Arabia is very, very large. So the situation is totally different when we talk about Middle East comparing to Europe. We believe that there is a huge possibility to adopt different kind of services. I mean, it's not only because of 5G or of IMT. It is, matters related to spectrum efficiency as well. We have less utilized spectrum in UHF in terms of spectrum efficiency, and our mandate as a regulator to ensure the most efficient use of spectrum. We think there is a good possibility to have a co-allocation in the coming WRC 23. Then, I mean, reallocating the band or reusing the band might be difference between country and to another in terms of adopting the mobile services, like what we had, for example, in 700 megahertz. We in Gulf area have adopted the 700 megahertz probably earlier than other European countries, and the evolving was natural. We think the case might be seen as well in the 600 megahertz.
Great.
And thank you very much.
Thank you, Mohammed. Okay, if we switch tack slightly, Jonas, I think you had a question from a while ago about what consumers want for the other panelists.
It was really building on what I had in my initial remarks, because I mean, I think we really have to focus on where are the eyes of the consumers going, where is the production of content, where is the media industry going, and it was really a question to our industry representatives. Rather than stating that your networks or your technologies are much better than the others, how does that sort of correlate with consumer demand and where the media industry is going? Thank you.
Great. Perhaps first, if we could get a broadcaster perspective on that, Jean-Pierre.
Yes, thank you, Mark. Yes, well, I'm not sure where the consumer is going. Otherwise, I would have bought a couple of stocks a few years ago, and maybe would be retired at that time. But what I can say, we are part of an alliance which is called the Wider Spectrum Group, which gathers industry representatives from the media, but also the content production, public service broadcasters, broadcast network operators, also PMSC industry representative, but we also have in our group employee organizations, such as people who work in that industry, or also journalists. And we also have a consumer representative. And I think they all agree that they like free television. They all agree that they have access to wireless microphones and live entertainment associated to that. And they all agree that spectrum, at least in Europe, in the way the things are structured, is a vital asset for that industry, wherever it is going. And the last thing I would say is that the results of penetration we have show that linear television and digital terrestrial television has adapted successfully to many revolutions. We have adapted to digitization. We have adapted to digital cable, digital satellite, to IPTV, to the arrival of the iPhone. We're adapting to Netflix. There's something we cannot adapt. We need spectrum. We need spectrum. Otherwise, we cannot compete. We're not trying to deliver the television that people watched 30 years ago. We are trying to deliver the one they will watch in 10 years, and that requires spectrum. Thank you.
Uli, Glenn, do either of you want to comment on this?
Yeah, let me say something. So I to again try to answer as best I can. I won't claim to know what the consumers want, but maybe some comments on what the consumers are doing. And yes, we do see continued usage of linear TV. Of course, linear TV is not just DTT. There's other platforms as well. There's satellite, there's cable, there's IPTV type platforms as well. But what we also see, I think it's clear, is an increased usage of on-demand TV, catch-up TV, non-linear TV, whatever you want to do it. So I think there is a trend there, at this time, alongside linear TV on the different platforms, for on-demand TV to be increasingly what the consumers are tending to do, and I guess that means they probably want to do it. Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Okay.
Maybe one more thought. So as I said, I think we need certain flexibility in the use. And many things that people tend to use at home, next step, they want to use it outside when on the road, when not being connected to a wire or Wi-Fi and a wire. So this is, I think, where really mobile has that additional spectrum need. On the other hand, I think we need to look more cleverly maybe at the spectrum use in UHF. So looking at these many countries responding to 224 with 2400 megahertz or more demand, this is a demand for a country to go with something like 6 multiplexes in a frequency reuse like 4. But 3/4 of the resource are not used in a given place for that broadcast service. And PMSE use with wireless microphones is proof that there typically are very clean 8 megahertz channels for that particular use. PMSE use is mainly in cities. Yeah, so I hear people quoting elections where they need like 200 microphone lines in a parliament on the evening of the election, or there are certain events, but mainly in cities. Mobile could use the very same channel maybe in rural areas to provide additional downlink capacity. I guess we have to have a closer look at what is the geography of the actual spectrum use, where do we have spots and pockets, so not touching the existing use, but providing smooth migration paths with additional use. And then we can certainly debate, does that all require co-primary mobile allocation or not? But I think we should definitely look at more clever use of what is underutilized currently in UHF by broadcast.
Yeah, thanks, Uli. I think I understand what you're saying, although some of the material in the presentation earlier, I think, showed sort of the interference distances that we might be talking about in the context of uplink, which makes some of that a bit challenging, perhaps. But anyway, moving on to the next question. I think, Elena, you perhaps had a question for the mobile industry around efficiency of use and the need for the 600 megahertz spectrum.
Yes, thank you, Mark. Yes, because when we, back some years ago, when we were at the first WRCs where the mobile industry started to look at the UHF band used by broadcasters, they say, oh, we need really the 800 because we need more spectrum under 1 gigahertz because the propagation characteristics, we need to cover rural areas, we need to provide there more capacity. Again, it happened the same with the 700 megahertz band. We need for rural areas, we need for coverage, for capacity. For the 600, we are again back with the same argument we need for rural areas. For me, I think that the 600 megahertz will not solve the problem of rural areas. I think rural areas, the main problem is the business model. There are not so many people, and it's costly for the mobile operators to understand. I agree with them. So I think it's more the business model than the spectrum. But maybe they have another view. They have an explanation to that.
Yeah, do we have any thoughts on that, Glyn, perhaps?
Yeah, let me try and respond to that. Yeah, as I tried to explain in my presentation, the coverage of rural areas is not straightforward, and it's very important that there is the ability to be able to provide a reasonable level of capacity for the rural areas at a reasonable cost. And it's clear that UHF spectrum provides the best opportunity in order to be able to do that. Not just providing the coverage itself, but also providing a reasonable level of capacity in those areas, and very importantly, particularly for 5G, a consistency of user experience for some applications such as IoT and things like road automotive applications, connected cars, etc. So yeah, I think that maybe addresses at least partly the question. Thank you.
And if you allow me, Mark, to add on what Glenn mentioned about Helena's question, I mean, I think one of the main answers we have seen, it worldwide during the last year, during the pandemic. I believe the natural reallocation happened for 800 in the beginning, then 700, have supported the international community to provide better conditions in rural areas. I will be speaking about Saudi Arabia. Allocation and assignment of 700 and 800 have helped us a lot in terms of bridging the digital divide and of providing the health and distance, and as well as the education at home at these rural areas. Now the question, the demand is increasing or not? According to our study, yes. Without this allocation of I mean, for example, if we talk about 600, will we, I mean, provide the services toward these rural areas with reasonable prices and reasonable cost on the government? I think having more allocation will reduce the cost, even for the government, to provide the services to this rural areas. When you talk about connectivity, we talk about something a must right now. The situation right now is not at all as the situation 10 or 15 years ago. Right now, we are meeting on distance. We expect people in rural areas to attend this kind of meeting. And I think having more spectrum, especially in lower frequency band, will reduce the cost a lot. I mean, talking about the business model, sure, it is complicated, but I mean, the formula is more spectrum, 100% less amount of investment to provide services in rural areas. And this will be my last sentence, in Saudi Arabia, I mean, subsidize, and like other countries, huge amount of money to provide the connectivity to rural areas. With more spectrum, the prices will be less and less.
Thank you, Mohammed. Perhaps if I can add my outsider's perspective on this, I think in the context of digital divide and services in rural areas, it seems to me quite clear that there's a big difference between the type of mobile service that can be provided using a 100 megahertz, 3.5 gigahertz band carrier, which is predominantly deployed in urban and suburban areas, and the type of service that can be deployed using 700 or 800 megahertz spectrum in rural areas. So in that sense, I completely agree that more sub 1 gigahertz spectrum could help to even out that performance across a mobile network. However, I then also think that I'm not sure the 600 megahertz goes far enough in solving that, in that the 600 megahertz is another low carrier size band with limited bandwidth akin to 700 and 800. It doesn't make the jump to get you up to the kind of services that you have in urban areas. So definitely it helps, but does it solve the problem? I guess, Mohammed, the Saudi Arabian view is that it substantially helps solve the problem, and therefore, particularly in the context of lack of DTT demand, is worth doing. More widely, I suppose my question would be, does it make sense for other parts of Region 1 to go down that route now, or start making preparations to go down that route now in order to have a 600 megahertz band eventually? Or does it make sense to think in a bit more detail about the long-term requirements and consistency of service across mobile networks and see if there's a sort of alternative band plan that might be able to do something more, and potentially, if it doesn't involve uplink, also accommodate DTT usage at the same time? Others may disagree, but I don't know if anybody has a perspective on that. Jonas?
Yeah, without, I mean, in Saudi Arabia, the band is unused, i.e. there is a technology that could be implemented fairly easily in the 600 band. Good for you. In Uganda, you need to get television out in rural areas. Good for you. How do you encompass all of that in the same model? I think that requires some sort of smart use of spectrum. We see that countries, Uli referenced Switzerland, that has discontinued terrestrial television, i.e. you have all of this beautiful spectrum being unused. That is a waste of natural resource that can be used to provide, well, something. Today, they can only use it for broadcasting, which they've decided against. That's not a Swedish perspective, but we have seen numerous attempts and more or less efficient attempts of salami slicing over the years. 800 and 700 are examples of that. If you just look at how much waste we created in salami slicing, in sort of guard bands, mid bands, etc., reverse duplex orders, etc. I think we should look now at a potentially smarter way of actually managing both the Ugandan situation and the Saudi Arabian situation, and potentially also the Swedish situation over time. And I think that requires enabling countries to move at different paces and actually answering to different demands in different times. Thank you.
If I can come in too.
Sure.
Yeah, I think it's worth noting here that WRC-23 is not going to be discussing frequency arrangements or band plans for this spectrum. It's discussing the regulatory measures in terms of the radio regulations. And so what we're talking about is not, which is the best band plan for this frequency range, but what I think, will help the discussion in the future is to be able to enable whatever is decided to be the best solution, or probably solutions in different parts of the world, to be implemented. And the problem is, if you just have only broadcasting as the only primary service allowed in this band, whatever broadcasting means, and I think that's open to debate even, then you're unnecessarily constraining that debate and unnecessarily restricting the set of possible solutions and possible outcomes that are available to you in the future. And that seems to be quite a short-sighted thing to do, in my personal opinion. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we're going to move shortly on to questions from the audience, as I see quite a few of them are coming through. Just in the final 2 minutes before doing that, I'm going to allow one final question in this section, which I think, Jean-Pierre, you had a question aimed at the regulators here around the balancing act of spectrum managers and how investments play into this.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Yes, I was listening to what Jonas said is the dilemma, and I realize it's probably a very tricky situation. And I was wondering how you were actually considering the balance between established services which are used, and of course, because the future is unknown, maybe they will be less used in the future, but maybe not, nobody knows. And actually many people were wrong about that previously, and versus the potential future use that may appear on other services which have been successful, but for which there is evidence that the demand is now moving to higher bands because they just allow to have higher bandwidth, which is what people want now. How do you balance that? Especially considering the vested investments and the underlying industries which are behind.
I might come in. Did we have a minute and a half to respond to that?
Something like that.
Something like that. So I will not respond to that. I would say that, I mean, in our view, as the future is unknown, you must enable different futures. That does not mean throwing out investments that have been made. But it also means that in countries, France, Italy, many countries which are heavily relying on terrestrial broadcasting, that should be an investment that should be sort of soundly secured. In other countries, that's why Switzerland or Saudi Arabia are interesting. Should that make it impossible to do other solutions in those countries to protect that somewhere else? I think that we need to work spectrum harder. And this is a very important and difficult task for all the beautiful engineers out there to actually manage that, rather than saying that coexistence is impossible. I say, well, go and make it happen. Do your things, engineers of the world, and we will do our things as regulators. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other responses from any of the other regulators before we move on to Andre and then Irene?
I will briefly. Yes, if you allow me. The existing experience indicate that if one country continue to use broadcasting services, high tower networks, and another country wants to introduce some mobile networks, there is a huge problem if it's overlapping frequency band. So it's really created some challenge for us as the spectrum community, have to say, to design something new, actually. We just cannot transfer the approaches from the past to the future and expect that the outcome will be different. It's stupid, actually. And I also just have to say, indicate what we actually have a task to think about what kind of flexibility we mean, how it can be looked in technical form, in regulatory form, and what actually the trends in the broadcasting world, because as we indicate, there are controversial trends. One trend is to move everything in IP, but it's not to move, it's a copy. It's a copy. You have both linear world of television and IP world of television, and they have to live together, how to say. And another trend, and we clearly have seen this during the COVID phase of the last year, that the population are trend to move back to the linear services when the common communication infrastructure fail to provide high quality IP service. And it's clearly indicated in many countries, because the load on the communication networks, and even I don't mention mobile networks, I mention all networks, including the fiber one, which is most awful thing. You have the fiber network which have failed. So the quality degrades and the population go back to linear services. And this indicates the clear challenge for us as the technical planning community to think about how to really think about the convergence in this area. Because otherwise we never fulfill the task. The television trends are very clear. It's going to higher resolution, more colors, more additional information and whatever. And in future, it will be 360 degrees panoramas and whatever we can expect. You may smile, but it's the future. It's unavoidable. Sooner or later, who knows? But it's a clear trend. And we have to fit all these things into the, how to say, very low capacity communication channels. We have to think about it. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Andre. Irene, coming to you on this one before we move on to the audience questions.
Thank you very much, Mark, and my colleagues, Jonas and Andre, indeed are looking at the current community to find the solutions, because as Jean-Pierre was asking, where's the balancing act? Yes, you want to address the customers at the lower end of the pyramid who are not yet IP, and therefore still using a lot of the traditional linear platforms. Then on the other end, you have the more affluent that are able to, use the IP technologies. And as mentioned, more and more we keep talking about, this is the reason we keep talking about spectrum sharing in different bands. We recognize that these technologies are all developing at the same time. Glenn mentioned they need the spectrum to be able to, compete. And we recognize this. So as a regulator, us is to give the consumer a choice, not to box them into particular technologies, but rather give them that opportunity to choose what they want to do. And of course, from our regulatory side, we say, let the technical people sort it out. We want the solutions. Yes, we said we're not discussing the band, the band arrangements, but the band arrangements help us to be able to have relevant regulatory provisions. So it's all of us coming together to find how can we coexist or have these services continue to grow. And as we were talking about the cost, we all know that at the end of the day, the cost has economies evolved. So if only a small group of people are using a certain technology, there is no way this whole promise of cost-effective or low cost is going to be realized, because there'll be no economies of scale.
Yeah, fully agree, Irene. Thank you very much. Okay, so we'll move on for the final 20 minutes or so to taking questions from the audience. We've got 10 of them posted to us for the moment. So 20 minutes, 10 questions, average of 2 minutes a question, guys. Let's try and get through as many as we can. So the first question I have here is for Elena on asking how it could be possible to include 5G in the trials taking place in Germany and Austria from NTRA.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you for the question. Well, I think this is a very, very technical question. I'm not been involved myself in the trials, so I don't know how the integration has been done. But for example, for the trials in Stuttgart, the 5G Media to Go, they are certainly involved with Deutsche Telekom, the mobile operator in Germany, where they are sharing, I think, 3 or 4 low power, low tower stations that they have together in combination with some high power, high towers that our broadcaster has, the SWR, and they're trying to combine those these networks into to try to ensure that they deliver broadcast content to mobile cars. So how the integration is done itself is a very technical, and I don't know myself, but I can provide more information, or at least the contact persons that are involved in this later on, because there is a lot of equipment that has been developed as trials for the trials. And the universities have also been involved. So there's a lot of interesting work that can be shared.
Thank you, Elena. Second question then is for Uli, coming from the regulator in the Ivory Coast, or Côte d'Ivoire, I think. Says almost all Western African countries are still in the process of deploying DTT in 470 to 694 megahertz. How could they share the band with IMT systems? Quite a wide-ranging question potentially, but Uli?
Yeah, thanks very much. I think that really hits the point. So uplink is hard to protect. I think we all agree on that, and Nick had that on his very first slide. I tried to outline that, well, with a frequency plan in DTT or also in analog TV, there are lots of unused channels in every specific location. So let's say a downlink ecosystem in phones could be used to address that either with 5G broadcast or with supplemental downlink potentially. The ecosystem is not there. So that's, I think, the piece we need to work on jointly, and where, to our belief, a co-primary mobile allocation could substantially contribute to.
Thank you. By the way, for everyone else on the panel, where a question is specifically directed at one person, I'll come to them first. But if any of you do have something to contribute on it, just stick your hand up, or otherwise jump in. If not, Elena?
Yes, thank you, Mark. Can I also provide some comments to that question? As you mentioned, there is the interference issue that we need to take into account. In particular, if we are receiving DTT with rooftop antennas, because the rooftop antennas, the filter is quite large. So you may have interference. So this is an issue that is not so easy to solve. We can solve it, but there are some technical issues that need to be addressed as well. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, next question comes from Vincenzo at Agicom, saying that 4G broadcasting was not as efficient as DTT in terms of the number of programs per megahertz. How does 5G broadcasting compare in that context? And secondly, sharing between DTT and 5G broadcasting, how possible is that? I think we probably can get perspectives from both sides here. Uli, you want to jump in first?
Yeah, if I may. These spectrum efficiencies are always hard to compare on a real one-to-one base. So you certainly can achieve quite high bits per hertz on a DTT carrier when you do frequency planning and you have very clean channels for this 8 megahertz carrier, for instance. But you also need to consider the overall spectrum demand. And I guess that again links back to my earlier comments. You need 224 megahertz or something like that for 6 national multiplexes, whereas mobile typically works with a reuse of 1. So if you only look at a single carrier, spectrum efficiencies are not that high, but you don't need a full set of something like 4 frequencies, for instance, to deploy that nationwide, but you can do just with that resource. So overall, mobile also has gone down the path from frequency planning, like in GSM 2G, to reuse 1 systems. So these had been old debates, GSM versus CDMA in the past. But with the result, I would say that these reuse 1 systems eventually are spectrally more efficient because they don't need that frequency planning problem.
Yeah. Elena, Jean-Pierre, did you want to add? Yeah.
Yes, I'd like to say that it's difficult to compare both things. Broadcasting is a one-to-many technology, and we're delivering the same content at the same time to millions of people. With mobile, it's a one-to-one transmission, so it's completely different, and you are not transmitting or sharing this content with the rest of the population. So the efficiency needs to be considered also this point of view, I think. And also, sorry, going back to the 5G and DTT, the same. DTT is mainly focusing on delivering content to the same content, linear content to a large population and receive at fixed locations. This is the main focus. And 5G broadcast is going to be more efficient for mobile devices and not to fixed reception, because in that case, DTT and in particular DVB-T2 is much more efficient, can provide much more content, much more capacity than 5G broadcast. 5G broadcast is an LTE-based technology, it's a mobile based on a mobile technology, so it's more adequate for mobile delivery.
Yeah, and if I may, I would add that actually we see Broadcast Networks Europe that 5G broadcasting would be complementary to DTT. It's not a replacement. It's complementary to reach a different set of receivers that we are not reaching yet with our system, or not very, very easily because of the ecosystem and the technology. But as Elena said, I think the efficiency of DTT is unmatched, and I don't think 5G will change anything. And actually, 5G efficiency, I think, is not so different from 4G in terms of radio interface. It's more the capability for us to reach mobile in terminals, which is useful. And in that case, I think as a complement, 5G broadcasting, to answer the second part of the question, 5G broadcasting could be introduced the same way we have, at some point in time, introduced the DTT as a complement to analog. Thank you.
Thank you. This is a rather nice segue, actually, into the next question that's come up on our screen, which is from Anacom in Portugal, asking whether it would be possible for 5G broadcast to become the future delivery platform of linear TV services to large TV sets in-house. So I think from what you're saying, Jean-Pierre, you're envisaging it more as a complementary rather than substitutional.
Right, right. In theory, perhaps it could be done, but we don't see any advantage compared to what we have right now with DVB-T2.
Uli?
Yeah, so maybe eventually fixed reception is anyhow not what we should spend UHF spectrum on. So if we really get excellent broadband connectivity into households, if we have the possibility to mount satellite dishes and whatsoever, so eventually I think radio waves should be used to support mobility. That would not exclude that, considering that there is a decent amount of programs available on a 5G broadcast for mobile devices. You could also imagine 3GPP type receive technology in large screens and use the very same signal to also feed these. But so I think what we need is some migration path from status A, where we are, with some countries still relying heavily on DTT, others having not so much DTT in place. How can they migrate, maybe even at different pace, from a world where fixed reception now is the main target of DTT systems to large screens, into a world where you can have that kind of entertainment in the self-driving cars, as mentioned by Elena, and so forth, and have appropriate distribution paths also to the fixed screens at home, which may then more go on like a broadband line, for instance.
May I add a comment to that? I think it's not yet clear whether even for fixed reception, DTT will no longer be used. It is clear, for instance, in some countries, and I think we have the example in the United States, actually, where DTT penetration is increasing because it's very nice complement to OTT access. And so it's when you are looking at DTT, you're not looking only at a technical system. You're looking at a way to distribute free television. And this is what is usually not possible even through broadband infrastructure. Could be, but that's not the case. And I'm not sure the operators would want to.
Elena.
Thank you, Mark. Another point is the reliance on the quality of the DTT platform, which is really, really stable in terms of quality, and it does not collapse independent of the number of users that you are having. So broadband platforms are very good, but so far they cannot substitute also DTT for that. I agree with Uli. Once we have fiber to the home everywhere, yes, I mean, you can put all TV content there. It's going to be reliable. It's going to be stable. But so far, we are not there yet. I think in most of the world.
Yep, Andre.
I really believe that the case with the fiber, which is not available to all public, the fiber normally is purely commercial thing. So you have to pay money, you have to connect, you have to have some negotiations with some providers, so on and so forth. But the public, how to say, free-to-air transmission is available everywhere, every time. Whatever much television sets you have, you capable to connect. It's not difficult. So we should consider the possibility to provide the public available open to connect fiber, something like that in that case. And I believe it's still not the case in most of countries. So for that case, all this discussion about the fiber or TV is not correct formally. It's different things.
Thank you, Andre. Thank you all. I think those were some good points. It's obviously a complex area. Changing tack slightly, the next question that we've got is more of a technical question, asking whether 470 to 694 megahertz is actually an overly broad definition in terms of antenna requirements. In particular, for above 548 megahertz, the antennas can be accommodated in tablets and phone-sized handsets, but lower parts of the band require a larger antenna that's maybe better suited to home or car use. Is that sort of accord with people's understanding here, or does anyone have a view on the extent to which the lower part of the band can also be used in mobile devices of roughly today's size?
Yeah, maybe that's again a question mainly going to a manufacturer side. And while I do not really represent a handset manufacturer, nevertheless, we have looked into such topics. So indeed, antenna design for the low bands needs to be looked into. But there are, for instance, 450, 410 megahertz networks with handhelds. So things can be done. There is some performance drawbacks maybe on the antenna, but then you have better propagation conditions. So someone will still have to do the exact math, but I think it's fair to state that the bands are still very relevant and interesting from an implementation perspective in the handsets. And then, as rightly stated, we may see very different devices there. If it comes to using it in homes, let's say in a holiday home somewhere, you could have outdoor CPEs with way less form factor restrictions on antennas. If you think of cars as rolling hotspots, you could have nice antennas on the outside of the car for that band, high performing antennas, and then have Wi-Fi within the car to further get the content onto mobile devices, for instance. So I think this is not precluding the interest of the industry in the band.
Thanks, Uli. Next question I've got is a potentially slightly controversial one. I'll read it out and then allow people to comment, but it says there's an increasing evidence of considerable volume of spectrum inefficiently used or not used at all across a number of bands. Evaluating the real efficiency of spectrum usage would show much less need for fresh spectrum for IMT. Why does such evaluation continue to be a taboo to the ITU environment? I think I'd be interested to get a regulator's perspective on this as well, but I take the inefficiency point here to be more about some bands that have been assigned to mobile operators not always being used in all countries, or at least not in all geographic areas of countries, rather than a sort of technical inefficiency of the technology point. And I think it's true that there is, in some instances, spectrum bands that aren't being heavily utilized after being assigned. But in general, I would probably take the view that they are mostly being used, at least within substantial portions of countries. Jonas, you're nodding along. I don't know if you want to say anything on this one.
No, I fully agree. And that goes for almost any band in the world, that they're heavily underutilized. And that's really one of the problems why spectrum is an increasingly costly business. If you take sort of an antenna and stick it out the window anywhere in the world, it will mostly be silent because of reuse patterns, because of its satellite spectrum being used somewhere, its radar spectrum, it is aeronautical, etc., etc. So the underutilization of spectrum is really why we're having these type of conversations all the time. I think that it is really time, and if you look at what we've said from the RSPG and many others, it is time to start working spectrum harder, to actually start sharing spectrum more efficiently, and actually seeing that sharing of spectrum costs inefficiency, and we would probably have to make restrictions on how to share it. So I fully agree. Giving exclusive spectrum to a use that is not used over the complete area and all of that spectrum, it is a waste, and that is taking spectrum away from potential other users. And I think that's really, to me, a heartwarming idea to actually start working spectrum harder, but that will cost. Thank you.
Yep. Does anyone else want to come in on that one before I move on? Mohammed?
Well, I think very nice and good question. I think when we see the RED regulation and we see the national allocation table worldwide, and also the national registers in each country, you will see each of these registers or tables fulfilled of different radio services. But the question, is the real utilization reflecting what we see in the allocation tables, what we see in the national registers? I think, as Jonas just mentioned, it is not the case 100%. We do have some artificial scarcity, if we could say it. And I believe our mandate as a regulator to ensure, not just by sharing, also by some kind of initiative of reallocating some of the bands, need to be done during the coming years, as we see some increase and some demand for certain services. The question talk about the IMT. I believe yes, not all of the IMT band implemented worldwide, but I don't know. We can compare the IMT to the other services. I think probably we will see it in each angles and different radio services, which includes IMT and others. Initiatives, I think, for sharing, which might be costly, as Jonas mentioned, we need as a countries and regulators to work on. The other thing, I could say, brave decisions of reallocating some of the underutilized spectrum need to be done during the operator. I know it's difficult for each WRC or each regional meeting of reallocating. To be honest, I've been attending, 2 WRCs right now and attending so many this discussion during ASMG, Arab Spectrum Management Group. It is not always the case technical discussion. It is market competing with other market. We see it very clear in the WRC. We see, for example, market of satellite, of mobile, of broadcasting, or any other market want to protect their band as their territory. However, our mandate as a regulator to be wise and to take brave decisions to serve the public and to serve our societies.
Thank you, Mohammed. Uli, final comment on this one, and then we'll move towards wrapping up.
Yeah, indeed, this efficiency of use, I think looking at the mobile use, that heavily depends on what bands you look into. So in 26 gigahertz, probably you don't see much signal nowadays, also being a very recent band and not even assigned in many countries. But take the 800 megahertz band, which is in the UHF, yeah, assigned in every European country, all 30 megahertz. Maybe in a typical situation, 3 operators, 10 megahertz each, and you would find these 10 megahertz populated with a signal on the downlink everywhere in Europe with some, I don't know, maybe 95% area probability, 98, 99% population probability. So I would claim that these reuse one mobile bands are extremely used, and that's exactly the point why additional spectrum makes a lot of sense in these low bands for these rural areas. Thank you.
Thank you, Uli. So I think we've more or less run out of time. So unfortunately, there's a few audience questions that we won't get to answer. So my apologies to anyone that asked those. What I want to do just to close is to offer any of you that would like to come in with a final 30-second view on what you'd like people to take away from this session. I'm happy to pass over to you in the order that you've spoken. If you'd rather not, then feel free to pass on to the next person. A lot has already been said, of course, but final comments, please, no more than 30 seconds. Firstly to you, Glyn, if you've got any final comments.
Yes, I mean, I guess my closing comment would be that I believe that having a primary mobile allocation in this band at WRC-23 will provide flexibility to enable us to use the spectrum in the most efficient way in the future. Yeah, that's brief closing remark.
Thanks very much. Elena, over to you.
Thank you, Mark. So just briefly to say that DTT plays a key role for public service media to bridge the digital divide. We have seen that in the COVID times, in times of crisis, that it was very important for some people to be able to receive a free-to-air signal with information and with education for the kids. So we need the stability, we need regulatory support for that, and not to forget that we are trying to innovate, we are trying to develop new businesses, new technologies, and for that also we need the support from regulators to continue this innovation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Uli?
Yeah, thanks. Also to echo Glyn's comments, we believe we need that regulatory flexibility in terms of a co-primary allocation, which should then allow to really protect what had been stated by DTT, what allows, like Mohammed, to introduce 600 megahertz FDD, and that allows maybe cooperative and intelligent sharing opportunities in those countries or along those country borders where countries want to use something different than just the current DTT use with the band. Thank you.
Thank you. Jean-Pierre.
Yes, thank you very much. Just to recall that the 476/94 megahertz spectrum is vital for terrestrial television. There is, I think, ample flexibility within the current regulatory framework, and contrary, I think a change would not increase flexibility, it would actually reduce it and create eviction for a very important sector, both for the industry, but also, and more important, for the people and the general interest.
Thanks very much. Jonas, any final comments from your side?
Very briefly, I would just want to thank everyone in this panel, not for solving the regulatory dilemma, but to make it even more complicated. And also, I think that spanning the view between sort of the Ugandan view, the Russian view, and the Saudi view really displays that these are very, very difficult questions. So thank you, everyone, for sharing. And I will take all of this into further consideration on how to work on the dilemma. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonas. Mohammed, any final comments from you? You're muted, Mohammed.
Thank you very much, Mark, and the colleagues in the panel. I would just conclude with the Jonas sentence, which is different demand in different region. We need to collaborate. I mean, as administrations and countries with each other. We don't want to see the C-band. I mean, transparently, we don't want to see the C-band situation again in the radio regulation. So we want, as administration, to work with each other, to understand each other, to not have any fragmentation, I could say, in the radio regulation in the future.
Thank you. Irene, any final thoughts from yourself?
Thank you, Mark. Very interesting session to have participating in, and I think it brought out more the issue all of us are talking about of spectrum sharing and why it is so key. Just like the last question that has just been addressed about spectrum efficiency and availability of spectrum that's not being utilized. So as Jonas put out, I guess our work is cut out for us, that we have to then also innovate in our spectrum management and bite the rubber so that we manage to get spectrum and manage to balance the Jean-Pierre question of how do we handle all the choices and all the technologies. So thank you very much.
Thank you. And finally, Andre.
Thank you. Okay, so summarizing this discussion, also I have to mention that, of course, very interesting frequency range we have spoken about. The not only well propagation for the useful signal, but also the very well propagation for the interference. So when we're speaking about flexibility, we should take this in mind, actually. And in this particular frequency band, you cannot do in one city one thing, in another city different thing. You have to collaborate, actually. So I invite everybody to think about collaboration in this frequency band. Thank you.
Thanks, Andre. Thanks very much. From my side, I won't try and summarize too much of the content, just to say that I think there's been a lot of interesting questions raised, both technical, commercial, regulatory, associated with the process. Not things that we can seek to answer today, but hopefully setting out some things that will be useful to consider in the run-up to WRC-23. I'd like very much to thank all of our panelists and Nikolai, who was here at the start to give the opening presentation. I think it's all been really interesting, and I hope that it's been enjoyable to watch from home as well. Dan, that's it from me.
Mark, thank you so much. And I think I'd like to add a thanks to you for expertly moderating that webinar. It really was interesting, and it's no mean feat to, I think, moderate a panel with 8 participants in there. A fantastic job with that. So thank you very much, Mark, as well. I really appreciate that. And I think to echo what Mark has said, thank you again to all of our panelists. An absolutely fascinating discussion. I think it's clear there's some very different perspectives here, but I think it was really interesting to hear all those different points, and yeah, hopefully everyone out there found that useful, and a good way to get an overview on some of the different positions and thinking in this area. And thanks to all of you out there for all of your contributions as well. I think we got through quite a few of the questions. I know we didn't get to all of them, but we do really appreciate all of your questions and comments, and I know that there was a good level of discussion going on the chat as well, so really do appreciate all of your contribution in that way as well. So that's just about it. I think I'd like to finally wrap up just by mentioning the next 2 webinars that we have taking place in this series. So on the 14th of April, we're going to have the next webinar, which is going to be looking at the C-band. And then on the 27th of April, we're going to be having the webinar looking at the 6 gigahertz band. So the C-band, as I said, is up next. So that's going to be on the 14th of April. And you can see on the screen here some of the speakers we have confirmed who are going to be taking part in that in a similar or in exactly the same format as we have today, with speakers from the industry side and the regulatory side, and having an interactive discussion in that way. So once again, thank you so much to Mark. Thank you so much to all of our panelists, and thank you very much to all of you out there. As I said, we're going to be back with the next webinar on the 14th of April, and look forward to hopefully seeing you then. Until then, stay safe, look after yourselves, and yeah, we'll see you all again very soon. Thank you very much.